Good evening, everyone. I have the honour of speaking to you tonight about the Biodiversity Heritage Library, or the BHL. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live and work, the Boonwurrung and the Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I would also like to acknowledge the First Peoples of every part of Australasia, because that acknowledgement is generally missing from the material I work with. Materials such as this. These illustrations are from rare books and historic journals that were written and published in Europe. They all accompany the very first published descriptions of new species, or at least species that were new to science at the time. You can see from the dates that these articles are from a time when the animals of Australasia were being discovered for the first time by Europeans. The text that accompanies these illustrations very rarely contains any acknowledgement that there were already a people on these lands who had an intimate knowledge of both the biology and the behaviour of these species. Before I continue, I need to make a slight adjustment to the title of my talk. I was sure we'd reach 60 million pages by the time I spoke to you today, but it seems I was a little optimistic. The global pandemic has affected our work for much longer than I expected, and we haven't quite hit that significant milestone. We're currently at 59.6 million pages uploaded onto the Biodiversity Heritage Library website. I was also pretty optimistic about being able to talk to you at this symposium in person. When Chef Rogers wrote to me in April, I was sure I'd be able to travel to New Zealand to attend. But here I am, still in my living room in Melbourne, where I've worked since March 2020. I'm really sorry I can't be in Dunedin tonight, but I'm still thrilled to be able to speak to you about my work with the Biodiversity Heritage Library. Thank you to Chef Rogers and to Donald Kerr for inviting me to give this talk. It's an absolute honour to be opening your symposium. I manage the Australian branch of the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is the world's largest virtual library of biodiversity heritage literature and archival materials. The project exists because the cultivation of natural science cannot be efficiently carried on without reference to an extensive library. This is a quote from Charles Darwin, and I'm sure Darwin would agree that access to an extensive library about biodiversity is critical to our understanding of our current climate crisis. I'm sure he'd also agree that now more than ever, when access to physical libraries has been so restricted, it's essential that we can access our library materials online and that these materials are freely accessible to everyone. The extensive library we've created on the BHL website provides access to books published as far back as the 1400s. This is the oldest book in our online collection, Pliny's Natural History, from 1469, which is one of the largest single works to have survived from the Roman Empire to the modern day. This treasure was digitised and contributed to the Biodiversity Heritage Library by the Natural History Museum in London. The London Natural History Museum is just one of 527 libraries across the world digitising their biodiversity heritage collections and making them available on the BHL website. Together, these libraries have digitised just shy of 60 million pages from over 274,000 volumes. This incredible resource contains information on millions and millions and millions of the world's species, and all of this information is freely accessible online for everyone. Those millions of pages are accessed by millions of people. Since the launch of the BHL in 2006, over 12 million unique users have visited our online library from 240 countries and territories across the globe. This year, we've had an average of 247,000 visits every month. Australia joined the BHL in 2010. We're nationally funded by the Atlas of Living Australia, or the ALA, and we began operation with just one organisation, Museums Victoria, here in Melbourne. Museums Victoria is the largest museum organisation in the whole of the Southern Hemisphere, and it has an impressive suite of venues. But this is our library. I use this photo a lot when I talk about the Biodiversity Heritage Library because for me, it really captures why the project exists. Like most museum libraries and herbaria libraries around Australia, our library is closed to the public, hidden away behind the scenes. But behind those doors are incredible treasures. Those treasures include 3 wonderful librarians, but also an incredible collection of rare books and historic journals, the foundation of our understanding of biodiversity. Very occasionally, special people get to go through those doors into our library. These are some true VIPs. They're our volunteers on a special behind-the-scenes tour of our rare book collection. Only a tiny fraction of our books are ever put on public display. This, I think, is one of the most beautiful books ever published. It's the first volume of Gould's The Birds of Australia, which was on display in Melbourne Museum's Darwin to DNA exhibition for 11 years. Sadly, that exhibition closed earlier this year, and the book is now back behind those closed doors. But even when it was on display, visitors were only able to view a single double-page spread behind glass. Luckily, all 7 volumes of Gould's The Birds of Australia are online on the BHL website, openly accessible for everyone. This publication was contributed to the BHL by Smithsonian Libraries. I've always been a bit miffed about this. As I said, the global project began in 2006, and by the time Australia joined in 2010, quite a number of significant publications about Australia's biodiversity had already been contributed by organisations such as the Smithsonian and the Natural History Museum in London. We had to find items to contribute that were not already on the BHL, or that were unique in some way. This actually wasn't hard. Museums Victoria's library was first established in the 1850s as a working collection for the museum's curators. Over its 170-year history, the library has evolved into one of the best collections of natural history books and journals in Australia. Among its collection of over 40,000 titles are some incredibly rare and significant treasures. Like this. This spectacular publication is Albertus Sieber's Thesauri, which was published in 1734. Now, there was already a copy of this publication on the BHL in 2010, which was contributed by the Missouri Botanic Gardens, but theirs was black and white. Ours was in colour, and it was thus far more special and significant than theirs. The Smithsonian later added their coloured copy, which is different, but it's not nearly as vibrantly beautiful as ours. You can see all 3 here and compare them. This publication is very rare, and the fact that each surviving copy is different is of great interest to both scientists and historians. The plates were hand-painted, and the colours are really different between the 2 coloured copies on the BHL. They're also bound quite differently. Museums Victoria's copy has all the text and the plates bound in separate volumes, whereas the other 2 volumes have the plates and the text interspersed together within each volume. Museums Victoria's library also contains many significant publications that no other organisation had yet contributed to the BHL. This is another of John Gould's publication, a much rarer one. It's a synopsis of the birds of Australia and the adjacent island, which was published 11 years before the Birds of Australia. It's a much smaller volume compared with Gould's spectacular folio-sized volumes, but it's just as beautiful. Each written description is accompanied by an exquisite illustration produced by Elizabeth Gould. This is my favourite. It's the first published illustration of Australia's major Mitchell cockatoo. Most of the illustrations in the book are just details of the head, but some, like this red-necked avocet, include sketches of wings and feet. John Gould is credited with producing the first scientific descriptions of almost half of Australia's bird species. Some of the descriptions were published in this little volume. The bird on the bottom of the page is the powerful owl. This is where, in 1837, John Gould introduced this bird species to the world. It's the powerful owl's international debut. My absolute favourite publication in Museums Victoria's library is the one that I'm most proud of contributing to the BHL, is George Shaw's The Naturalist Miscellany, which consists of 24 volumes published between 1789 and 1813. The Naturalist Miscellany contains scientific descriptions and illustrations of over 1,000 species that were sent to London from around the world in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Each description is accompanied by a spectacular illustration by Frederick Polydore Nodder, or in the later volumes by his son Richard. Because of the timing of this publication, it contains the first published scientific descriptions of many iconic species from both Australia and New Zealand, including, in 1790, the first scientific description of any species of kangaroo. You may have noticed by now that I'm a bit obsessed with the scientific descriptions of animals from the late 1700s and early 1800s, particularly from Australia, but also from New Zealand. At this time, the study of natural history was an esteemed academic pursuit backed by scientific rigour. I love reading the awe and wonder, and often the scepticism, in the words of the academics struggling to describe the bizarre species that live in our part of the world, and as they try to fit them into their current understanding of the natural world. George Shaw's description of the kangaroo notes that the female is furnished with a pouch, and his wonder just builds from there. He says, the female The kangaroo is a very anomalous and extraordinary quadruped. It is a creature of surprising agility and springs forward by leaping to so uncommon a height and to so great a distance as to outstrip the fleetest pursuit, the swiftest greyhound being easily and soon distanced by this wonderful quadruped. In 1792, he introduced the echidna to the Western world. He writes, "This extraordinary animal may well be considered amongst the most curious and interesting quadrupeds yet discovered, since it is not only an absolutely new and hitherto unknown species, but is also a most striking instance of that beautiful gradation so frequently observed in the animal kingdom, by which creatures of one tribe or genus approach to those of a very different one." And in 1799, he gave us this, which is perhaps my most frequently used example for anything to do with BHL. I hope by the end of this talk, you'll understand why. In this, the Platypus's international debut, George Shaw writes, "Of all the mammalia yet known, it seems the most extraordinary. It is the perfect resemblance of the beak of a duck engrafted onto the head of a quadruped. It naturally excites the idea of some deceptive preparation by artificial means. So bizarre was this creature that Shaw questioned whether it was actually a real animal. In fact, if you go to the Natural History Museum in London and look at the specimen from which George Shaw based his description, you'll see that it is cut across the neck because they were looking for stitches. They thought that the bill of a duck had been sewn onto the body of something like a water rat." Out of the 1,000 species descriptions in Shaw's miscellany, only a few had two plates. It seems that additional illustration, or perhaps proof, was required for those species that were truly perplexing, like the platypus and this bizarre creature. This is the first scientific description of a kiwi ever published. It appears in the final volume of Shaw's miscellany, published in 1813. Shaw described it thus: "The bird represented on the present plate constitutes a perfectly new genus, which is not easy to refer to any of the established ornithological orders. The general habit or appearance of the bird approaches to that of the penguins," and this illustration certainly reflects that description. He continues, "The size of this bird is nearly that of a goose, though the very different form of the beak implies a different manner of life." And then he again postulates whether someone had tampered with the specimen. He says, "There is no appearance of a tail, and in place of wings, unless any art of deception has been practiced, of which I cannot discover the least appearance, can only be perceived a small single joint on each side, measuring about an inch in length." This year, George Shaw's historic description of the kiwi was used to solve the mystery of where the first kiwi specimen was collected. In the Naturalist miscellany, Shaw reports that the specimen came to him by way of Captain Barclay of the Providence. Using digitised ship logs, modern historians were able to establish that the Providence was a convict transport ship and that specimen was collected in the winter of 1811 from Stewart Island, which is still home to one of 4 distinct remaining populations of the South Island brown kiwi. I've only seen one kiwi in my life, and it was on Stewart Island. It looked nothing like this picture. That said, nothing makes me happier than when the historic literature that we've put online is used in modern research, particularly in cases like this where it provides invaluable information about threatened species. I'll talk more about this later in my talk, but for now, back to Australia. I joined the BHL Australia project in 2014. By then, BHL Australia had grown from 1 organisation to 4. We'd been joined by the Australian Museum in Sydney, the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, and the Queensland Museum in Brisbane. All of these museums were located in the southeastern part of Australia, and they were all focused, as far as biodiversity was concerned, on zoology and paleontology. We were missing the plants, which are a really big part of biodiversity. So when I first started, a big part of my role was to try and expand this, to increase our breadth both geographically and taxonomically. So I contacted natural history organisations and publishers around Australia to try to encourage them to contribute their biodiversity heritage literature to our online collection. And we had a rather overwhelming response. Since 2014, BHL Australia has grown considerably. It now consists of 38 contributing organisations. We are now a truly national project with organisations contributing biodiversity knowledge from every state and territory across the country. These organisations include our state museums, state herbaria, state libraries, royal societies, government agencies, field naturalist clubs, and other natural history clubs and societies. And we've definitely got the plants covered. These organisations highlighted are either our state herbaria or societies that focus specifically on plants. Many of our contributing organisations would never have been resourced to do this work themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the BHL Australia project is nationally funded by the Atlas of Living Australia, and we cover all the costs of digitisation, metadata collection, file management, and website wrangling, as well as making the online content as accessible and discoverable as we possibly can. Our digitisation lab is still based at the Melbourne Museum, where we digitise both journals and rare books. On the right is Ellie Wallace, who started the BHL project in Australia, and she continues to champion it in her role with the Atlas of Living Australia today. On the left is our digitisation technician, Chris Healey, who's currently the only member of our team allowed on site. The rest of us have been working from home since March 2020. In normal times, we have a fantastic team of volunteers who do some of our scanning, as well as the majority of the critical work of adding bibliographic and page-level metadata to the content that we upload online. They too have not been allowed to work in our museum since March last year, and we miss them dearly. Prior to the pandemic, my desk generally looked like this, covered in boxes of library materials from across Australia that had been sent to us to digitise and put online. Most organisations are not comfortable putting their rare and fragile material in the post, but some have couriered rare material to us, and others have elected to personally deliver their library material to Melbourne, either by car or by plane. However, most of what we receive from interstate are journals. We're really excited to be able to make these journals accessible online, many of them available nowhere else on the web, and some are really quite old. This is the first volume of the Australian Museum's memoirs, which was published in 1851. And wherever possible, we try to complete our journal runs from volume 1 all the way through to the current day. This is an issue of the Australasian Systematic Botany Society newsletter that was published this September, and we made available online in October. Some of our more well-resourced contributing organisations have their own scanning equipment, and they're able to send us digital copies of their beautiful rare books. These lovely librarians are from the State Library of New South Wales. Their first contribution to BHL was this wonderfully random manuscript compiled by Canon Henry Digby between 1810 and 1817. Digby was born in Ireland in 1800, so he produced this manuscript from when he was 10 to when he was 17. It's a seemingly random compendium of natural history, ethnographic material, and antiquarian subjects from all over the world. And it features 11 species of Australian animals. The seeming randomness of his collection disappears, however, when you read his descriptions. Everything he drew was on display in Dublin at the time, and his drawings and descriptions, which often include text copied from labels, provide a snapshot in time as to how museum artefacts, natural history specimens, and material culture was presented and depicted in the early 1800s. The caption on this illustration reads, "The kangaroo, copied from a living animal, exhibited in Dublin." All of these illustrations and many more carry that same caption, "copied from a living animal," which is evidence that there was quite a menagerie of live specimens being sent to Dublin from around the world and put on public display. If you want to know more about this weird and wonderful volume, I point you to the BHL blog post about it written by Richard Neville from the New South Wales State Library. Digby's The Naturalist Companion is an example of a truly unique, unpublished treasure that exists as a single copy in a single location. This artefact has not been on public display since 2006, when it was featured in the National Library's National Treasures from Australia's Great Libraries exhibition. So we were completely thrilled that the State Library was able to digitise it in order to make it accessible on the BHL website. And now that we put it online, anyone, anywhere, can flick through these beautiful and bizarre pages. However, most of our contributing organisations don't have their own scanning equipment, and thus making their rare and fragile collections accessible is a little tricky, unless they're in our home state of Victoria, in which case we can go to them. In 2015, we moved our entire scanning operation, our staff, our volunteers, and all our equipment across the city to the National Herbarium of Victoria, which houses our State Botanical Library collection. We were there for 5 months, and in that time we were able to digitise their old and fragile journal material, as well as a significant proportion of their rare book collection, such as this spectacular volume of illustrations from New Holland, written and illustrated by Ferdinand Bauer in 1813. This is another of my very favourite publications on BHL. During our sabbatical at the Botanical Gardens, we developed a lovely working relationship with the librarians who've helped us to source and gap fill many of the botanical journals that we've worked on since then. And they've recently asked us to return to do some more scanning of their collection, which is very exciting. Another way to increase the Australasian content available online is to get a whole new country involved. In 2018, Adam Moriarty from the Auckland War Memorial Museum invited us to New Zealand to help them start a BHL digitisation project. The Auckland Museum is one of New Zealand's first museums and houses one of New Zealand's finest heritage research libraries, which was established in 1867. Visitors to the Auckland Museum are very fortunate because the fabulous library is open to the public and has shelves and shelves of books to peruse, as well as beautiful rare material on display. The Auckland Museum has several in-house publications, including a scientific journal, which began in 1930 and is still in publication today. They also have an extensive rare book collection with an impressive number of botanical publications. They are now digitising that collection and making it accessible on the BHL website. This was the Auckland Museum's first contribution to BHL, an epitome of the natural history of the insects of New Holland, New Guinea, New Zealand, Otago, and other islands in the Indian, Southern and Pacific Oceans by Edward Donovan, which was published in 1805. This rare work includes hand-coloured drawings and descriptions of over 100 species from Australia, New Zealand and the neighbouring islands. Since then, the Auckland Museum has uploaded many other works, including this notice of the discovery of a tuckahay from 1850, and this Memoirs on the Extinct Wingless Birds of New Zealand, published in 1879. Thus far, the Auckland Museum has contributed a total of 12,368 pages of biodiversity literature from across 51 volumes and 37 titles. And they're about to ramp up big time. In June this year, the Auckland War Memorial Museum received funding from the New Zealand Lottery Grants Board via their Lottery Environment and Heritage Fund to become New Zealand's Centre of Excellence for the Biodiversity Heritage Library and officially launch BHL New Zealand. This funding will allow the Auckland Museum to purchase equipment and employ dedicated staff to make New Zealand's biodiversity knowledge openly accessible to the world. As well as continuing to digitise rare materials from their own collection, the Auckland Museum is now able to do this work on behalf of research institutions, libraries and scientific societies across New Zealand. We're so incredibly excited for them and have offered any support that they may need over the coming years. Back to Australia and back to reality. In March 2020, I sent our staff and our volunteers home. For a full 8 months of 2020, we were unable to access our scanners or our library materials, and 2021 has not been much better. Last month, Melbourne was declared the world's most locked down city. In the past 20 months, I have only been able to work on site for a total of 13 days. With our digitisation operation shut down, we had to find work that we could do from home. This provided us with a unique opportunity to step back from our everyday workflow, to find new ways of making Australia's biodiversity literature accessible, and to make our existing content more discoverable. If any of you have heard me speak about our BHL Australia staff, and particularly our BHL volunteers, you'll know that there's no stopping them. Within days of me sending them home, several of our volunteers contacted me asking how they could continue to contribute virtually. We were locked down, but we still had a willing and dedicated workforce. The first thing I did, once the dust settled and we'd set up from home, was to contact all of our existing contributors to ask if they had any born digital or previously digitised content that we could upload. And then I started contacting potential new contributors. I almost cried reading the generous replies that rolled in. 22 organisations, including 7 new contributors, responded to our pleas for digital content. We were still in business. We couldn't scan anything ourselves, but we could still make other organisations' content discoverable on BHL. 2020 wasn't so bad after all. Despite the fact that we were completely locked down for 2/3 of the year, 2020 was our second best upload year ever. We made over 50,000 pages of Australia's biodiversity literature accessible on the BHL website, which was only an 18% drop from our best year, which was 2019. And last month, BHL Australia reached 3 significant milestones. We uploaded our 400th title, our 3,000th volume, and our 400,000th page onto the BHL website. But now that all that stuff is online, will people be able to find it? There's now so much content online, almost 60 million pages on the BHL website alone, but accessible does not equal discoverable. And much of my past year has been working on this problem. Before I tell you about this work, I have to acknowledge that the BHL already had some very clever discoverability tools. As I mentioned earlier, our online collection contains information on millions and millions and millions of the world's species. BHL has a way to find that information. Up on the right-hand side of every page on the BHL is a button that says Show Text. If you click on that button, you get a searchable version of the text from the book. Every page that's uploaded onto BHL is processed through optical character recognition software, or OCR, and the resulting text is made available online beside the page it was generated for you to read. You can see basically, this OCR text can also be read by machines. This is where the magic happens. BHL makes use of a very clever algorithm called taxonomic name recognition, which is a type of named entity recognition. Basically, it searches the OCR text for scientific names of animals and plants and compares them to a repository of accepted scientific names. Those accepted scientific names are the named entity in this named entity recognition. When it finds a match, it pops the name over here on the right-hand side. You can see that our named entity recognition has identified a lot of scientific names on this page. The bottom one is the scientific name for the thylacine, which is the beautiful creature illustrated here. If I click on that squiggly DNA symbol next to the name, this box pops up. It's a list of all the online databases that have a record of that scientific name. If I click on one of those, I'm taken to a profile page for the species. Now, this is really useful if you want to know more about a species that you've stumbled across on the BHL. This page, for example, tells you that the thylacine is a species of Australian mammal, more commonly known as the Tasmanian tiger. It also tells you that this animal is very sadly now extinct. If I go back to the page on BHL and click on the name itself, I'm taken to a list of every single mention of that scientific name across the whole of the BHL website, across all those almost 60 million pages. This list tells me that there are 990 mentions of that scientific name, which is Thylacine cynocephalus, all of which will be discoverable by anyone searching for the scientific name. And I can click on any of those and be taken directly to the page on which that species name is mentioned. In 2018, BHL introduced full text search. This was a game changer when it came to discoverability. It allows you to search the text across every page of BHL. Of course, it relies on the OCR, which isn't always perfect, but for me, this was like finding the key to the biggest treasure chest ever. Now I could search for common names, for Indigenous names, the names of people and places, and I could also filter my results by author and date and publication. But I had the most fun searching for random words like favourite, delicious, and wondrous, and disaster, and then filtering through to my favourite authors to see where they'd use those words. And I could also search for phrases like an animal of the past, which isn't a random phrase because I know that John Gould used that phrase in one of my favourite descriptions. If I search for that phrase from the BHL homepage, an animal of the past, I'm taken to a list of results where that exact phrase has been used across all 60 million pages, almost 60 million pages, on the BHL website. The words "an animal of the past" appears 24 times across our entire BHL collection. Each search result gives me a preview of the text containing that phrase. And if I click on that first one, the one written by John Gould, I'm taken here to his description of the thylacine. It's here in 1863 that he gave us a warning. He said, "When the comparatively small island of Tasmania becomes more densely populated and its primitive forests are intersected with roads from the eastern to the western coast, the numbers of this singular animal will speedily diminish. Extermination will have its full sway. And it will then, like the wolf in England and Scotland, be recorded as an animal of the past." There's that phrase, an animal of the past. "Although this will be a source of much regret, neither the shepherd nor the farmer can be blamed for wishing to rid the island of so troublesome a creature. A price is already put upon the head of the native tiger, as it is called. But the fastness of the Tasmanian rocky gullies, clothed with impenetrable forests, will for the present preserve it from destruction." John Gould was partly right. Tasmania's gullies and impenetrable forests protected the Thylacine for the present, for John Gould's present. The last Tasmanian tiger died in a zoo in 1936. It is our hope that by making this historic literature accessible and discoverable, we may learn not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The BHL's incredible search functionality, particularly its taxonomic name recognition tools, make our online collection an invaluable resource for researchers. These tools also make it really easy for me to convince organisations that this is where their biodiversity content needs to be. However, these tools only work within the BHL website, and if you want to be truly discoverable, you need to be discoverable via the tools most people use to find stuff online. If external search engines can't find our content, we may as well have left it collecting dust on a shelf. So let's do a Google search. I'm a big fan of Alfred Russel Wallace. I want to know what species he discovered when he was working in the Aru Islands. Top of the list of search results when I search for this is an article on the BHL. It's this one. List of species sent from the Aru Islands by Mr. A.R. Wallace to the British Museum, published in 1858. This journal article is particularly close to my heart because it contains the first scientific description of my favourite Australian mammal, the striped possum. Alfred Russel Wallace collected this specimen in the Aru Islands and sent it to the British Museum, where it was described by John Edward Gray. Gray confirmed it was indeed a species new to science, and he published this paper, in the Proceedings of the Zoological Society of London. Now, the BHL is primarily a library project. The primary bibliographic unit in the BHL is the bound item. Librarians around the world digitise bound library items and upload them onto BHL, along with their item-level bibliographic metadata, data about the volume and the title the volume belongs to. So in this case, the data uploaded with the volume was volume 26 of the Proceedings of the Zoological Society of London and the publication date, 1863. The bibliographic metadata that's uploaded with these library items is searchable outside of Google, and that's great for librarians, but it's pretty useless for anyone searching for the content published within these journal volumes. Google was only able to find this article in BHL because we are now adding article data to BHL in order to make all of the biological knowledge locked up in these historic journals discoverable both within and outside BHL. And this is what I've been doing in my living room for the past 20 months. And also what my team have been doing in their home offices. Chris Healey, who normally does all our rare book scanning, spent 2020 making those rare books more discoverable. He had the pleasure of compiling the article level metadata for George Shaw's The Naturalist Miscellany. All those species descriptions now have article data on BHL. And they each have their own landing page, which makes them discoverable by both people and search engines, as well as by all the algorithms and bots that link online content together. I could talk for another hour about the modern linked network of scholarly research and how we're pulling the historic literature into it, but I've only got time to briefly touch on that work now, so you're going to get the short version. It all revolves around DOIs, Digital Object Identifiers. A DOI is a unique, permanent, and persistent identifier in the form of a clickable link that can be used by anyone citing a piece of literature. A DOI carries all of the bibliographic metadata for the publication it's assigned to. Modern journal articles get them at the point of publication, and we're now retrospectively assigning them to the historic literature so that we and our users can find, cite, link, share, and track the scholarly content on the BHL. We assigned a DOI to the first scientific description of the platypus in October 2020. That DOI can tell us that since October last year, that 1799 article has been mentioned in 331 tweets, 7 Wikipedia pages, a blog post, a news story, and 3 academic papers. I've been actively tracking the performance of this new DOI, and I get notified of its research output. I was extraordinarily excited when last year I got a notification saying that it had been cited using its new DOI in an academic paper. But I was blown away when I was notified this year that it had suddenly been cited in a publication from 1999 and another from 1995, over 20 years before we'd given it a DOI. It turns out that the publishers of these 1990s journals, Oxford Academic and Elsevier, had rerun their citation indexing, which resulted in our retrospectively assigned DOIs being retrospectively linked to these old citations. This totally made my year and sent me down a rabbit hole looking for older examples where our content had been cited in the past. BHL has been assigning DOIs to monographs since 2012. This is one of those, assigned to Audubon's Birds of America. Using this DOI, I discovered that the earliest citation of this publication picked up via DOI tracking was in 1858. We now have a linked citation between Audubon's The Birds of America and this 1859 article in a German ornithological journal. The DOI system allows readers to link from article to article online, and now our historic literature is part of that linked network of scholarly research. This is the other place your content needs to be if you want people and search engines to be able to find it, Wikipedia. This is where having a DOI really helps, because adding a citation to Wikipedia is super easy if the publication has a DOI. Wikipedia has an automatic add a citation function. All you have to do is paste a DOI into that box, and all the bibliographic metadata attached to the DOI is inputted into Wikipedia as a beautifully formatted citation. And that's all I had to do to add this citation to the Wikipedia page for its illustrator, Frederick Polydor Nodder. Clicking on that DOI in Wikipedia will take you directly back to the primary literature in BHL, which is another link in our linked network of knowledge. This is the final article I'm going to share with you. It's a historic insight of population changes of the platypus across time, published only in 2019. In the article, the authors state that evidence for decline in abundance and distribution is critical, and it's possible only through the inclusion of historical information. And this is why the BHL is such an invaluable resource, and why it's so important that the knowledge within its 60 million pages is discoverable and persistently citable by today's researchers. So that's what we do at BHL. We make the foundation of the world's biodiversity knowledge accessible and discoverable, and we link it to modern scholarly research so that we can continue to build on that knowledge today. Those of you in New Zealand who have biodiversity material in your collections, I encourage you to get in touch with the Auckland Museum. And if you're in Australia, please get in touch with me. Thank you again to Chef Rogers and Donald Kerr for inviting me to speak to you tonight. The program for the rest of the symposium looks amazing. I'll be listening avidly from across the ditch. Thank you to all of you for listening. I'm very happy to now answer any questions you may have.